This video is to provide some additional context for the material that's discussed in Unit 2. In Unit 2, we begin to consider the concept of applied ethics, that is, how ethics operates in the real world of business. Of course, an initial question to consider is whether business ethics are different from personal ethics. That is, whether a person can have one set of ethics that governs their behavior in business situations and a different set of ethics that governs their behavior in personal, non-business situations. I suspect that the answer to that question is that unless a person is attempting to deceive others, a person has one set of ethics, and that set of ethics applies in all situations that they face. But the circumstances that a person faces in the business environment are different than the circumstances that they usually face in their personal lives. One of the largest subjects where ethics applies in business is the relationship between employers and employees. There are laws that govern the employment relationship, but the ethical aspects of that relationship go beyond the law and establish the character of every employment relationship. An employer can comply with all of the laws and legal requirements of the employment relationship and still treat employees in such a way that they consider themselves to be mistreated. Of course, no one should be mistreated, but mistreating employees is counterproductive in business. Unhappy employees are unproductive employees. So ethical treatment of employees is not only right, it's also good for business. But how can employers ensure that employees are doing their jobs properly without seeming to interfere with employees' freedoms and without seeming to be overly controlling? The answers aren't easy. Drug testing is a particularly difficult situation, but indicative of the tension that can exist between employers and employees. On the one hand, employers have a legitimate interest in knowing if employees are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, for that matter, because employees who are impaired are not as reliable and not as productive as employers have a right to expect. And probably more importantly, employees who are impaired on the job pose a danger to themselves, to other employees, to customers, and to the general public, especially if they're operating some sort of machinery. On the other hand, the United States Supreme Court has determined that people have a constitutional right to privacy, and drug and alcohol testing of employees while they are at work can be viewed as invading employees' right to privacy. Some of the issues that drug and alcohol testing of employees raises include, what about an employee who uses drugs while not at work, and though no longer impaired when back at work, the drugs or alcohol show up in a drug or alcohol test? Can an employer prohibit an employee from engaging in specific behavior while they're not at work? Or what about an employee who's taking prescription medication which shows up in a drug test as a prohibited substance? Can an employer penalize an employee for taking prescription medication? Is an employer even entitled to know that an employee is taking a prescription medication? And what about an employer who discovers that an employee has a banned substance in their system? What can that employer do about it? Should the employer offer the employee counseling, rehabilitation, or can an employer have a zero tolerance policy that penalizes the employee who violates the policy. Drug testing is only one of the many difficult ethical questions that have to be addressed in the employer-employee relationship.